Hello class. In this lecture video we're going to begin our discussion on decision making and some of the thoughts and some of the considerations that were given early on when we first really start examining human beings and what it takes and what it means to make decisions. So again, just in this lecture video we're going to look at how do people know when they're being logical and illogical. And I know what you're saying right off the bat. I make logical decisions all of the time. However, I have a lot of friends and I know a lot of people who seem to make a lot of illogical choices, and it's confusing to me and I don't understand why they're doing it. Well, I can assure you that we all make more illogical decisions over logical decisions, and we're going to go through why that occurs and the processes, the cognitive processes that occur as to why that happened. But when we're talking about illogical decisions, we're not saying that people are doing it because they're uneducated or because they just don't know any better or because they're ignorant. We're saying that because of the way the human brain works, we tend to do some things. For example, take shortcuts when it comes time to make decisions. So we tend to be a little less logical, or we tend to be a little less rational when we're making our decisions versus a purely logical, purely rational decision maker. So let's stop for a second and talk about what that means, because there are two very important comments here on what do we mean by logical and what do we mean by illogical or rational. From now on we'll use rational and non-rational. Well, when we first started studying economics, and we had people who were writing about economics and writing about how individuals make decisions and how managers make decisions, they have to make some assumptions when they begin studying this stuff. And one of the assumptions that they made was that individuals or managers are logical human beings. They're rational human beings. And they make their choices in a rational way. What does that mean, I make my choice in a rational way? It means that I am able to clearly identify what the problem is. That's number one. Number two, I need to be able to gather all the relevant information. Not only gather, find it, right, and then gather all that relevant information, be able to discern it, and then choose a whole bunch of alternatives, actually choose every possible alternative that could result in different decisions being made, choose my criteria or what decision will yield me or the organization the best results, make that decision and then follow through and evaluate that decision. Those are the steps that are involved in kind of that rational model that economists talk about. So as you could guess, that's a pretty involved, pretty complicated process that managers need to go through. So we'll look at that. We'll reflect on some of those things a little bit in this module, and then we'll look at how the thought has changed. Instead of this is how managers should be making decisions, we'll look at how managers and even individuals actually make decisions. So let's start off with defining a decision. A decision is a choice among available alternatives. So there has to be alternatives in order for there to be a decision. If I go into a restaurant determined to get a sandwich to eat and they say we just have ham sandwiches, there's no alternatives. I'm going to get a ham sandwich because I went in there with the intention of getting something to eat. If they have a bunch of alternatives, ham and turkey and roast beef, well then now there's a decision to be made. I need to decide among those different alternatives. So the first criteria for a decision is that there is various alternatives. Decision making is the process. So again, when we're talking about a process, it's a bunch of things happening together, including what am I thinking, why am I thinking that way, what is my behavior. All of these things are working together as a process to identify and choose alternative courses of action. So what is going on as I'm deciding among these alternatives, in my example, a sandwich. The rational model of decision making, again, this came about because it was really the only way economists could view an organization, is that if rational people were making decisions in the best long-term interest of the corporation. It's really the only way we can determine what's the best way to run an organization, what are the best decisions to optimize shareholder value in an organization. It explains how managers should make decisions. It assumes managers will make logical decisions that will be optimum in furthering the organization's best interest. Now, of course, we know, right off the bat, I'm not going to dispel rational thinking, but a lot of times managers aren't making decisions that are in the best long-term interest of the organization. We saw that with Enron and WorldCom and Bernie Madoff and all these cases we looked at, I believe it was in chapter 3, about ethics, that sometimes managers are making decisions in their own best interest, in their own short-term interest. They're not even thinking about the long term of their employment or the organization. So to assume managers make logical decisions that are in the best interest of the organization is a bit naive. And this is also called the classical model. So you may see something like, economists will call it the economic man. The economic man is the one who makes the best decisions to get the most value that he can for his or the shareholder's best long-term interest. That's the economic man, or it's also called the classical model. So there's 4 steps in this rational decision-making process, right? 4 steps. The first one is to identify the problem or opportunity. We talked a little bit about that, being able to identify the problem or opportunity. It seems very simple, but a lot of times managers will identify symptoms and not the root cause problem. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say my sales figures are coming down, or my sales numbers are coming down, or not where I think they should be. Managers may identify that as the problem, but it's really not. It's a symptom of something else. What could it be a symptom of? Well, it could be a symptom of maybe an inexperienced sales force, or an unmotivated sales force, or an obsolete product, or a product that has poor quality. So the root cause is really over here, and the symptoms are showing up. Well, I have to, as a manager, I have to separate the symptoms and try to identify the root cause of the problem. There's something called the iceberg principle, where managers are only aware of about 10% of the real problem, whereas 90% of the problem, like an iceberg, it lays under the surface and they're just not aware of it. So it takes some time to really identify the problem, because if I don't identify the right problem, I'm not applying the right tactics to solving that problem. I'm not making the right decisions in order to solve that problem. So number one, we have to, as hard as this rational model is, we have to identify the right problem or opportunity. We have to think about alternative solutions. So how many alternative solutions are there? How do we know when we've exhausted that list? How do we know when we've passed up on a good solution in order to look for another solution? And how much time and energy and money do we invest in that process of trying to come up with all these different alternative solutions? Then I need to evaluate each of those alternatives. So if I have 100 alternative solutions, I have to evaluate each one and say, what are the results? Predict, look into the future. What are the results of these alternatives? And what will they yield for me or the company? And then I need to select one of those alternatives, one of those solutions. After I do that, I implement and evaluate that chosen solution. So how do I look at it in an objective way? Because what a manager is going to want to do is say, I made that decision, it's the right decision. Let me find information that supports that I made a right decision, right? So we have to overcome that bias and objectively evaluate the solution in order to give the right kind of feedback. So, and hopefully there's some registering or clicking going on in your brains where you're saying, man, that really doesn't sound like how I make decisions, or maybe how managers and organizations make decisions. It seems very labor intensive, and labor, I mean cognitively intensive, and there's a lot of information, there's a lot going on. I don't know if people make decisions that way, and you're right. So some of the assumptions of this rational model create some of the problems. Number one, that managers are using complete information and they have no uncertainty. If you've ever worked in a business before, or when you do work in a business, or just in life in general, rarely does a decision not have uncertainty? Even if I'm picking a sandwich at a deli, I don't know maybe what kind of lunch meat they use, how is their bread, what do they use on it. There's a whole bunch of things that I am uncertain of as I'm making this decision. And business decisions come with a great deal of uncertainty or even ambiguity. When we're talking about ambiguity, we're talking about complete and utter fuzziness when you're making this decision. With uncertainty, I mean, there is a little bit that I know. I'm uncertain as to certain aspects. With ambiguity, the whole thing is just hard to define and understand. So the assumption of the rational model is managers they have complete information and there's no uncertainty about what their alternatives are and what the decision is going to yield. Another assumption is that there's logical, unemotional analysis by managers. And again, we know that to take emotion out of a decision is extremely difficult, if not impossible. Managers have prejudices. There's emotional blind spots. You have to be able to logically evaluate alternatives, ranking from best to worst, and according to personal preference, assigning some kind of value to each outcome, and then at the end of the day saying, this has the highest value, so that's going to be my decision. So, logical, unemotional analysis. And in the best interest or making the best decision for the organization. Again, a lot of times managers are faced with the decision of, do I gain in the short term, or do I do something that's in the best long-term interest of the organization? And as a human being, that's hard. We're designed to benefit in the short term. So the assumptions that are associated with the rational model, sometimes a little hard to digest if you've been in the real world and you kind of really understand what decisions managers are faced with. Some of the hindrances to perfectly rational decision making: complexity. Managerial business decisions are complex. There's a lot of variables. There's a lot to take into consideration. They're not simply as where do I park or what kind of sandwich do I get. They impact a lot of people. They impact workers. They impact the society in which you operate. They impact every shareholder of the organization. There are time and money constraints associated with it, so I can't spend 4 years making a decision. A lot of decisions need to be made almost immediately. Managers have different cognitive capacity, skills, values, habits, so there's a lot going on with each individual manager. Some are a little more intelligent than others. Some have more rationalizing skills than others. Some have habits that really allow them to focus and concentrate on a situation while others don't. So there's a lot of individual characteristics of managers that need to be taken into consideration. There is imperfect information. The world is changing. We have a lot of technology, we have a lot of information. A lot of that information is imperfect. It doesn't exactly address that root cause that we're looking for. So without the perfect information, it's hard to make the perfect decision. There's information overload, which ties into the previous one, where there's just too much information. How do I evaluate every alternative if there's this much information? Managers in different departments may have different priorities. So there could be a conflict in decision making there. There could be a conflict in the goals of the different departments or the different individuals. Maybe this decision gets me a bonus and it doesn't get this division a bonus. So all of these things kind of contribute and intertwine to really make that rational model somewhat unrealistic. Now, that's not saying we throw the rational model out the window and we say, well, we know managers don't think and act rationally, so throw it away. We need to find ways to allow managers and get managers to think in this logical, rational way. And there are tools to do that. There's mathematical tools to do that. But in the meantime, or in addition to that, we need to better understand how decision making is actually made. And that's where we get to the non-rational model, right? So we have the rational model, which we determined is a little difficult to follow, and then the non-rational model. This was first proposed by Herbert Simon, who was also an economist, but when he looked at the assumptions and the tenets of the rational decision model, he said, boy, that really seems difficult. It doesn't seem like that's the way managers actually make decisions. here's how managers actually make decisions. And the non-rational model assumes that decision-making is nearly always uncertain and risky, making it difficult for managers to make optimal decisions, right? So, whereas the rational model says there's no uncertainty, Simon says, look, there's nothing but uncertainty in the world of business. There's nothing but risk in the world of business. So that rational model can't be correct. And then he really talked about two things, bounded rationality and satisficing. And those are two important words to understand as we kind of move forward in our discussion on decision making. So this is Herbert Simon, sometime in the 50s, and he suggests the ability of decision makers to be rational is limited by a number of constraints. And we talked about them: complexity, time, money, cognitive capacity. Because of those bounds that are put on individuals, mostly cognitively, we have what he called bounded rationality. We can be rational to an extent, but because of the information, because of our intelligence, because of our ability to process information and find information, we are bounded. So we try to be rational, but we're bounded by constraints that are just out of our control. And then he talked about satisficing. Satisficing is when managers feel that they have examined enough information and they have looked at enough alternatives, and an alternative at some point seems attractive to them, they go ahead and pull the trigger, if you will, and make the decision, right? So, whereas the rational model says, I collect all information, I evaluate all alternatives, and I do all. Satisficing says, no, managers don't have the ability to do that. They'll look at just what they need to, and once they find the solution that in their mind is optimal, they'll go ahead and make that decision. So because of constraints, managers don't make an exhaustive search for the best alternative. Instead, managers seek alternatives until they find one that is satisfactory, not optimal. So satisficing is that where I'm doing it because that's all I can process, and this one seems okay. It's not optimal, but it seems like it'll do, and I'm going to make the decision based on that. So that's the beginning of our discussion on decision making. There's some very important concepts that we discussed here: the rational model versus the non-rational model. What are the problems with that rational model? Again, we're not throwing it out the window. We're saying we would love our managers to think that way. And there's some ways that we can get them to make rational decisions. But in the meantime, we have to understand this descriptive way of making decisions, how people actually make decisions. And that's the non-rational model, which contains the two theories of bounded rationality and satisficing. In the next video lecture, what we're going to do is we're going to take this a step farther, because Simon kind of stopped there, and researchers were really saying, well, yeah, but there are times when people make rational decisions. So why do we make rational decisions sometimes and non-rational decisions other times? You don't always make non-rational decisions. Sometimes we're going through the steps and making rational decisions. Why is that? And the next video we'll talk about more about the way your brain works, particularly System 1 and System 2 thinking.